Now, our military analyst Sean Bell is with us. Highly significant day, isn't it? 500 days since the war started. And now these cluster bombs are being sent in, something that is highly controversial. Why is that?
Well, it's worth pointing out, Nick, that these cluster munitions, whilst they're controversial today, they were a central part of most Western nations' inventory for many decades during the Cold War. They're an area weapon. Before we had precision weapons, we still needed to strike targets like tanks, which were mobile, very difficult to do with a precision strike. Whereas cluster munitions like this, I used to fly some of these when I was operating in Germany. They're incredibly effective against tanks and the like. The way they operate, clearly, they are a single munition delivered from an aircraft or actually from the ground. Once the weapon gets near the ground, it depends on how high you need it to operate. It will trigger the outer skins to come off the weapon, as we're about to see here, and then you can see that the cluster munitions it releases a whole load of munitions which are then forward in an area, often the size of a football pitch, onto the ground. Now, when they hit the target, and if the target's anywhere in that football pitch, that will be hit. The trouble is the vast majority of those bomblets do not hit the target. They're expected to go off on the ground. But certainly back in the day, they had dud rates of up to 10%. And those munitions, unexploded munitions, would then lie around the battlefield for years, decades to come. And there are tens of thousands of civilian casualties that resulted in the decades since they were used. There has been a statistic that says over 98% of the casualties caused by these munitions are actually to civilians in the decades afterwards. As a result, over 120 nations have banned their use anymore, no longer procure them, no longer use them. But of course, those nations don't include Russia, Ukraine or America.
Interesting timing here, isn't it? We've got the NATO summit coming up, and President Biden gave the green light to sending in these cluster munitions just yesterday.
The timing is really important, isn't it? Because with the NATO Vilnius summit next week, I don't suppose that they would really have wanted to announce this just before it. Almost certainly that reflects the timing imperative of getting these weapons in to Ukraine swiftly. The US have been very careful to brief this, that they've said that President Zelensky desperately needs more weapons, that the counter-offensive is strategically crucial. Over a month in, it's still not actually delivering the results that they might have hoped for. And one of those reasons is the trench system that's there, and the minefields, trench systems shown here, are incredibly difficult for Ukrainians to overcome. You could try and use precision weapons to take them out, but you need so many, they're just not available. Whereas cluster munitions could be extremely effective against these sorts of targets. They're certainly available, and they're available in significant numbers. And it's also worth pointing out, despite the nuanced argument around this, President Zelensky is involved in a war of national survival, and therefore that's undoubtedly influencing the decision of the US and Ukraine.
Nevertheless, allegations are bound to surface of hypocrisy against the US and potentially President Zelensky.
That is absolutely right, and it's slightly difficult for the US here because they've been very critical early part of the war of Russia using these weapons, and yet the Americans are not signatories to the agreement. They've got huge stockpiles back in the US, and actually Ukraine has also used these weapons earlier in the war as well. What the US has said, though, are two main things, one of which is Russia is using them on Ukraine soil, so it's Ukraine that has to deal with the fallout from all this, not Russia. And secondly, Russia's been targeting civilian casualties. This bit of video footage is from Kharkiv last year, very early in the war, when Russia was targeting the civilian population with them, and also, therefore, unexploded bombs will lie in the middle of the city, which would be really dangerous. Ukraine's been clear, we're not using these against our own people, we're not using them in the cities, they'll be in open areas, they'll be targeting the trenches and almost certainly the minefields. And if they are effective, then, of course, that will justify the decision that the US and Ukraine are making. But whatever, this decision is incredibly provocative, very controversial, and whatever happens, President Zelensky alone will hold responsibility for the unexploded ordnance and the impact that will have for the next generation of his Ukrainian colleagues.
Yeah, they'll certainly leave a legacy, won't they? Sean, thank you for now.